country. None of us are immune from this possibility.
I also wanted to point out something that a Nobel laureate said to me when he was on a panel that we had, and he said that science denialism is not universal. He said someone may not believe in vaccines, but they want their airplanes and elevators inspected by engineers. They don't want them inspected by, some guy off the street. They want their cars, to make sure that they're going to, run. So he said it's not all, a person who is a science denier may not be a science denier of everything. A person who may not believe in vaccines probably believes that the earth is round. He may even believe in climate change. So it can be selective.
I don't think it's a great phrase, honestly. I mean, I understand that we need words to in order to talk about these things, but science denialism, somehow it kind of sounds like someone doesn't believe in any science at all. And as you say, like somebody who someone may go onto YouTube to talk about why the earth is flat, and they are relying on the science behind the internet to be able to convey that. But I have certainly as a journalist in writing about science, I mean, I have been very much face to face with the denial of certain kinds of science since I started. And so I was writing about evolution pretty exclusively when I was starting out as a science journalist at Discover magazine. And so, and I was the one who would get all the hate mail at my magazine. So these are readers of Discover magazine who were, fine with, the reporting on medicine, the reporting on astronomy and so on. But evolution, that was the live wire. And people my colleagues wondered, like, why are you getting all the hate mail? The thing is that, that the opponents of evolution, the creationists themselves, they would not call themselves science denialists. They would not say that they were anti-science. They would very forcefully claim that they were following the science, and then they would give all sorts of sort of nonsense arguments, that, oh, there are gaps in the fossil record, therefore evolution isn't happening, and all sorts of fallacies. But so yeah, I mean, and so it then becomes an interesting issue of, like, why will it be that people will have one particular area where they are not just holding a view that is not the scientific consensus, but will often create this story in which the scientists who are promoting that, whether it's evolution or vaccines, are part of a conspiracy that is trying to do harm to people.
I've also read articles that you should look at the financial reasons behind it. And I think one of the cases that struck me, which was highlighted on 60 Minutes, was that there's a scientist who said that bacteria causes ulcers, which went against the prevailing wisdom that ulcers are caused by stress. And he ended up losing his funding, and he actually ingested bacteria, and he almost died to prove his point. And then the end of the segment, they show all these, a big conference of the American College of Gastroenterology showing hundreds of, booths about bacteria and ulcers. And there's also, it made it in a way more acceptable because, the claims for ulcers went sky high once it was linked to bacteria. When it was linked to stress, back in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, people were sent to psychiatrists. And as my dad pointed out, when he worked for the space program, he never got an insurance claim for a psychiatrist because people were afraid to put it in.
Mm.
So I thought that was,
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
interesting.
I think for me, I mean, what the story of Barry Marshall and the discovery of Helicobacter pylori, the bacteria that's linked to ulcers, is that it just shows you that science is not sort of a is it's not like a divine revealed truth. It's not like the curtain is pulled back and there it is and everything is known. And science evolves, it changes, and so the those scientists who thought that Barry Marshall was wrong, like they did have a lot of evidence that they could point to say, and to question what his claim. And you know there's sort of there is a kind of inherent kind of suspicion of very novel claims in science because most novel claims turn out to be wrong. And this one didn't. But the sad thing is that he did have to go through all of this process just to make this point, which is now like yeah, it's accepted because it's true. I mean, because Helicobacter pylori really is linked to ulcers. And it has opened up a whole complex new way of thinking about not just ulcers. They're also very important for gastric cancer. We didn't know that until someone really looked carefully at these bacteria. And the flip side is that it's actually might not be a great thing to get rid of your Helicobacter pylori, even though there's this risk of ulcers and gastric cancer. At least you don't want to get rid of them too soon with antibiotics, because getting rid of that microbiome, these residents of the microbiome in children, has been associated in some studies with increase in allergies and other immune disorders. Um, so that's that messy process of science. But if you think that when a scientist says something, it has to be absolute truth, then if some other scientist says like, well, guess what? We've looked deeper at it and actually it's something else. The temptation is to say, well, you lied to us. The experts have lied to us. We can't trust the experts. These experts are lying to us because there must be some reason that they're lying to us, and it must be some sort of nefarious motives. So this is a real paradox with science that I think scientists need to recognize. Journalists who write about scientists have to recognize is that it is. If you're going to write accurately about science, there's going to be this sort of inherent kind of vulnerability to misinterpretation, because if people come to science thinking that it delivers, absolute unfixed, I'm sorry, absolute fixed truths, then they may feel betrayed, and that feeling betrayal can be exploited by people who want to foster that distrust.
So, the title said we're going to talk about how to combat science denialism, for both, journalists and researchers, as well as, for the average person who has. I have a cousin who refused to get vaccinated, and I haven't failed to convince him. So I don't think I'm going to at this point. So, I was just wondering. So, I mean, journalists, we're skeptical. We read something and something seems like, oh, ulcers are caused by bacteria. Well, I've never heard that. So we immediately bring some skepticism into, like, once, and we also talk, it just can't be one study, it's got to be more. So how do we, so you can't argue logically with the person who has a belief that the earth is flat. And you can't argue logically with a person who thinks that Bill Gates, has funded these vaccines, which he didn't, and is putting microchips into our body, which he's not. And because you can't argue with craziness, but you can argue, I think, sometimes. They sometimes say that if you want to get more patients compliant with the medication, it's the way you take it. And if you say to someone, "Here's a pill, why don't you try it?" And the person says, "Oh, well, I don't know." Then if you say to the same patient, "I have given this regimen to every patient I have, and they've all been helped. I think it will help you." They're more likely to do that. So, what do you do when you're confronted with science denialism? I know the letters you got discovered. You just, there's nothing you're going to say to them that's going to convince them.
Well, the thing is that journalism, just sort of by its nature, is not really like it's not it's this happens a lot sometimes, that we mistake uh, journalism for something else. So journalism is not actually like an argument that one has with some particular person. That's not how journalism works. Just, but so I don't see it as like, oh, I, as a journalist, I am engaging in arguments. As a journalist, I am writing articles. That's what I do, and I write books. So, so I think, the first thing to do is just to sort of like recognize what you're, what kind of business you're in, what that format can and cannot let you do. Um, but I would certainly agree that under, that it's crucial to understand the effect of the words that you choose, the sort of the rhetorical structure that you have to your pieces, that makes a big difference in how your story will be received. Just like you mentioned, the doctor who is, if a doctor says two different things, the response from the patient could be quite different. So the way that you present things in your stories can affect how it will affect readers. Now, if somebody is, the other thing to recognize, is that people are not born flat earthers. Like these are things that people take a journey to become. Um, and these days, a lot of that journey takes place on YouTube. But but my point is that that along the way there may be opportunities to engage with people as readers, or as listeners to podcasts or so on. Um, and so, but you have to sort of really think about, who your audience is and what they might be bringing to to their story if they're reading a story. Um, you know, I think in the long run, the maybe the way to deal with this will be to real for journalists to really engage in a really meaningful way with all of the research um, on sort of how people take in science information, on the sort of the psychology of misinformation, or of denialism. Um, that area is just really just a few years old, but it is, developing some interesting ways. I was actually just reading, this is an advanced reader's copy. I'm just going to put it up here, called Foolproof by Sander van der Linden. So I'm finding it very interesting. Just as I think it's a good encapsulation of van der Linden's own research and some of the work that other people are doing. So one thing people may have heard of van der Linden, one thing he's been doing is coming up with this idea of kind of a misinformation vaccine. In other words, rather than just like wait for misinformation to spread and for a lot of people to sort of get entrenched with certain kinds of science denialism, he's been sort of experimenting with, well, how can you sort of present people with a very sort of little weakened form of that misinformation, but put it in a context to show how it is the product of um, these certain tactics that are used to persuade people that some sort of misinformation or disinformation is true. And it's interesting because they have actually done a lot of studies, and they actually have like these sort of online games that people play, and they're scientists, like they're doing these studies and they're getting some interesting results. I don't necessarily know how games could translate into sort of the journalism world. Maybe we as journalists need to kind of rethink what we're doing. And I also think we have to be realistic that a lot of what people like van der Linden are doing, they're doing it in the luxury of of a research university. He's at University of Cambridge. That's where like you have people who are, just you can get, undergraduate students to come into your lab and you can run studies on them, and or you go put something online and you get that certain slice of the public who are really interested already in these issues and want to engage with it. But then how do you reach that person who might be kind of like, on the way to flat earth world? They may not they may not want to play that game. They may not want to read my articles. And I think that is a challenge that I don't, I maybe other people have cracked that nut, but I haven't.
So we have scientists like Dr. Fauci who have had death threats against them and their family. Kind of reminded me of that, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, and he's not a politician. And so it's a little more dangerous world out there for scientists.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, Paul Pelosi is not a scientist. We should make that clear. But he,
No, of course.
he was a victim of what seems to be politically motivated violence, based on a lot of political misinformation. But with that, we have to wait and see what happens with that. But yeah, but yes, but yes, Anthony Fauci needs a security detail. I mean, that's the world we're living in, and that has been I that that is after repeated attacks on him by politicians, by media figures, and so on. It's not. I think it's hard to see that as any sort of coincidence. Um, I mean, but this is a repeated pattern. I mean, I would say, and sometimes it's more violent, sometimes it's less so. But the key that you see again and again is scientists are are villainized. Now, that doesn't mean that particular scientists are above criticism. That doesn't mean that I mean, if journalists should do investigative journalism on scientists, and when if they find things that are important to report, those things should be reported. But this is a different sort of thing where you saw this where in the 1990s with creationists going after evolutionary biologists. Those evolutionary biologists are immoral. They don't care about your children. They are elitists. They don't care what you think. This is the sort of thing that would play out at school board meetings, okay? And it made a lot of headway. I mean, so that the teaching of evolution was really in the United States was very hampered. Global warming. One of the A big event in the sort of global warming history was somebody, we don't know who, stole emails from climate scientists, and then those emails were cherry picked to sort of create this image of leading climate scientists as being bad people. and therefore they're bad people, and so you can't trust anything they say. And therefore, if they say that the Earth is warming, well, how could you trust them? They're not good people. Vaccine developers were then subject to the similar thing. So it's we've been here before, and that's just it's sad to say, but this is it might be in some ways more extreme, but it's not new.
So I just wanted to read something else that they talked about in the Nature article. A key finding to emerge from the work is that not responding to denialism does more harm than good. The authors found that the negative effect of science denial on the audience was greater when there was no science advocate to rebut the claims. And they give us an example. When President Donald Trump tweeted in 2012, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Do you want to guess how many times that has been retweeted?
I'm gonna guess maybe more than 10.
100 million times and generated thousands of responses.
Mm-hmm.
Vast majority of these responses were emotional, whereas fact-based rebuttals among those who responded was a very slim majority. So I think that's important that when someone says something ridiculous, that you just don't let it say, well, everyone's going to realize it's ridiculous, because everyone doesn't realize it's ridiculous, and people look for things that confirm their beliefs. So we have some questions, so I'm going to read them, and so if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So, questions from Anna. Traditional journalism strives to give a whole picture, pro-con view of a topic. However, in this era of mis and disinformation, writers understandably may not want to give more oxygen to false or dangerous notions. What are your views on airing all sides, especially in the light of this age of mistrust?
I think I'm not. I think this sort of pro-con image of journalism, I'm not really sure exactly how it came about. Like it. Let's say that you write, you're a sports writer and you are writing about a basketball game. You do not write a story where on the one hand, some people believe that the Knicks won 100-60, and another point of view where the Knicks lost 60-100. Like, that makes no sense. And you wouldn't want to look for someone who could say something along those lines, just to have balance. Like, the game is the game, and you're trying to report the game as it happened. Now, it's certainly true that let's say there's a political question. What should the country do about, let's say, what should the United States, just to pick my own country, what should the United States do about inflation? Okay. So they're like, if you just talk to one person, you would not be reflecting the different voices in a political process. And so, of course, like that makes sense to then, really kind of understand what is the conversation, what is the debate that's going on. But you would not in the article say, like, well, some people think that actually, there is no inflation. Like that, so I think we have to, like, bear that in mind in writing about science. Like and we don't just search for different views simply for the sake of having different views, and along the way just presenting things that are, that the scientific evidence doesn't support.
Okay. There's a question from Jelena Kalinik. We witness incorrect statements by experts, not to mention the Nobel laureates who presented disinformation. What should we do then? I treat expert opinion as the lowest level of evidence, and meta-analysis and RCTs are the highest for me.
Well, certainly, because I say so is not really, shouldn't have that much weight in science or reporting on science. And so, if as a reporter, like if you're talking to, you should definitely uh, talk to experts, and people who have a track record in the area that you want to write about. But that you should ask about, well, what is the basis for their assertions? And it's certainly true that randomized clinical trials are incredibly important. Now, over the course of the pandemic, unfortunately, it took quite a while for randomized clinical trials to be organized and then executed, and then for the results to start coming out for various treatments for COVID. So initially, like, you just didn't have the clinical trials to go by, and so you have to. I think it's still useful to talk to experts at that point when you don't have the RCTs yet. But you do have to acknowledge that we still need those, and that does. But unfortunately, I I found certainly that it was really important to explain over and over and over again, what is a randomized clinical trial? Why is it so important? What do you learn from it that you can't find from just looking, at just sort of associations and so on? So you can't just, as journalists, we can't just assume like, oh, everyone is on board with us about, the importance of placebos or what statistical significance is or so on. Because I think statistics is actually one of the, it's one of the least taught branches of mathematics in public schools, unfortunately.
Yes, that's why there will always be prayer in public schools when they give math tests. How to deal with scientific denialism when misinformation comes from authorities such as politicians? Is this the role of science journalism as a specific section, or is it important to make science present in all sections of a newspaper? So I guess they're talking about, should you review, scientists, should science journalists be jumping in on the, when, we have President Trump, making false statements, fact checking basically.
Yeah, well, I think it isn't. If public officials say things that are not true, or that claim that they're supported by science and they're not, like, that needs to be reported. Um, science journalism has, as a kind of a cultural institution, if you want to call it that, it has been a little set aside for it. You have. I'm sort of stammering here. What am I trying to say? That you have, like, at a newspaper, you will have people who are like on the political desk, and people who are on the science desk, people who are on the business desk, people who are on the sports desk, um, and but I mean, certainly, politics, influences how science gets done. So, it is good to sort of consult with journalists who have a lot of expertise on the political side. But likewise, there's a lot of politics involves science. Whether it's, how do we fuel our economy and not cook the planet, or how do we deal with the pandemic? And there, I mean, political journalists may feel a little unsure about how to report on that stuff. Then it's good to either just get to know how to be a science journalist, or just to collaborate with science journalists. So certainly in the pandemic, I personally, as a science journalist, have been working a lot with the at the New York Times with journalists from the political desk.
I remember I was at a conference, National Association of Science Writers, where I think it was Coral Davenport who said that I'm not a science journalist. She said, I report on climate, but I report from a political point of view. And I thought it was very interesting that the distinction she made. She said, I'm not going into whether it's, I don't address whether it's true or not. I'm just addressing what is happening in the political world. And I thought that was that. And to me, that she's a very valuable resource to read because she talks about oil, she talks about the economy and the politics. And and so I think it's great that science journalists can have these people to collaborate with and just to bounce ideas off. Because especially when there's a a political viewpoint, they may have a better historical perspective than we would have about this.
Oh,
Uh,
definitely. Yeah, definitely. And also, uh, yeah, and I mean, another thing to bear in mind, when someone like Davenport says that is just that, it's sometimes, readers are unhappy that, some particular aspect of a subject is not in a
mhm,
story I've written or that colleagues have written. And the fact is that like we don't have like infinite bandwidth. We write stories that are, several hundred to a couple thousand words long. Sometimes we go a bit longer. And so in order to like really kind of like report on some news in any depth, if it's something as complex as climate, for example, or the pandemic, um, you may only really have room to sort of really kind of drill into, the politics or drill into this, particular study on the effect of clouds on climate. You can't do everything all the time, all at once. It's just, and that's a challenge, but it's the reality of journalism.
I think another reality, which isn't talked about that much, is that people used to, we used to write stories. It was printed, and that was it. But now people, if they're online, people can make comments. And I've been asked by editors to, address one or two comments. You can't address, hundreds, but you can address one or two. And also, you know, you you're on Twitter, and people can comment on your articles, and they may say, I don't agree with you, and I look at who they are, and they're not a scientist, they're not a journalist, they're just someone, So I try not to get into. Well, I don't. I refuse to get into arguments with people about what I've written, and I also refuse to engage in people and try and correct their science, because that just leads you down this rabbit hole of 10 million tweets, and it can escalate actually
No,
impossible.
it's true. Yeah, no, it's true that it can, I mean, there are definitely some people who just want nothing more than to just start an infinite, Twitter exchange. And yeah, and time is limited. I agree. But I, I used I before Twitter was really a thing. I had a blog, and I really enjoyed that there were comments that people, there are people who took the effort to read my piece and ask a question or say like that doesn't make any sense, and then to try to engage with them. And and I think, I mean, at the New York Times, they do have a feature where there's a comment section to some stories. It's moderated, so they can only kind of allow comments for a certain fraction of stories every day, but it does allow for for some exchange. And if I have the time, I do like to sort of go in if there are people who have questions. Sometimes like maybe I didn't explain something as clearly as I could have in an article, and so someone has a question, I'm like, yeah, I could have done a little better on that. Like I'm not perfect, and so sometimes I'll go in and engage with that. If someone's like clearly just being insulting, or you can certainly feel like it's being done in bad faith, I agree, it's not, there's not much worth there. But these are our readers. We like without our readers, we are not read. So we certainly, that we should accord them respect.
So I just want to point out that someone asked me to share the reference for the Nature article. I did. I put the link in the chat. So this will probably be our last question. It's from Vivian. It says, I admire your work and output. This is for you. I apologize for being a groupie. I bet you didn't know you had groupies. But on
No
a given
apology
day,
necessary.
how much do you read and how much do you write? How do you pace your projects? Dealing with hate mail or denialist readers is hard and time consuming. I'm sorry you had to experience hate mail.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It sort of, I mean, basically, I'm writing every day, or if not actually like putting words on the page, I'm talking with people or reading things to do research. Um, I contribute a column to the New York Times. That's kind of my main journalism work these days. I used to write for other magazines, but not so much now. But then I also write books, and it sort of like fluctuates between the two, I would say. So aside from chatting with you today, David, I've been working on my next book just all day. Next week, I might be switching over and working on a new story for the Times. It's a fluid thing, and I just I try not to. The challenge with being a freelancer is that you could always be working more. And so I just try to remember that, like, I have a family and I have a physical body that needs to be exercised and all the rest of it. So it's a continual management.
I find sometimes when I'm doing something, I said, I should be doing something else. Or, I remember Woody Allen once said, whenever I'm directing a movie, I said, I should be writing a play. And whenever I'm writing a play, he said, I think I should be doing a movie. So whatever you did, so I thought that was funny. Okay, so I want to take this question. This is from Blanca Velasquez from Mexico. Good morning, good afternoon. What advice can you give for talk about the myths of the renewable energies on Twitter? Sometimes I am scared to talk. Also, I admire your trajectory and greetings from Mexico.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to like offer advice because I think that these exchanges are they're very much sort of embedded in our culture and cultures. So I don't know kind of what it's like in Mexico. I would be curious, to learn like what is this conversation like in Mexico. It's different from country to country, I think. I think that if you choose to engage people on Twitter, just do so in a mindful way, and just remember that things like Twitter they are engineered to engage you in a very quick fire emotional way. Even us journalists, like that's how they have engineered it in terms of our psychology. And so before I there was a while where I was tweeting a lot, and I started after a while I was like, okay, like I'm gonna write this tweet, and then I'm gonna like set it aside for like a minute or two, just hang it there in a sort of draft form, and then I'll come back to it. And I usually when I come back to it, be like, that's stupid. But in the heat of the moment, I thought it was really amazingly perceptive and really nailed the point. Um, so I don't I think we should take, as journalists on Twitter, we should do what we can to take care with it, just as we take care when we're writing articles and so on. If we're going to treat it as sort of a public kind of science way to communicate about science, we need to handle it with care, even if the medium itself kind of promotes carelessness.
So I want to end by saying that Carl has a website. It's carlzimmer.com. And there you can see his writings. You can also order his books. And if you want to see my interviews with Carl over the last several years, actually before the pandemic, we had several in person, which I kind of miss. But go to swiney.org, swimy.org, and just put in Carl's name in the search bar. And I've done 4 or 5 interviews with you, I think, in the last 2 years about your books and also about science denialism. So anyway, I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me and for Carl for accepting my invitation to spend an hour with us. And it's a great conference, and I want to thank, we had a very large turnout, so I'm very pleased with that. So thank you very much for spending time with us, and everyone else stay safe out there, and talk to you soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much for such interesting interview. Thank you for our audience, our attendees. Right now, the next session is starting now about blockchain.